Hello and welcome to the India debate, where each week we discuss the issue that matters with the people who count. Now, if there is a problem that usually ends up as a controversy in India, then undoubtedly it's the handling of terrorism. Whether it's the laws themselves or the police response to individual instances, there's always trouble to pay. So today we ask, why should this be the case and what can we do about it? With me to answer those questions, one of India's greatest police chiefs and the man credited with breaking the back of terrorism in Punjab, K Gill, and one of India's leading civil rights lawyers, senior Supreme Court advocate Abhishek Singhvi. Mr. Gill, let me start with you and let me begin with what in a sense is a subject of debate in India. Do we need special tough legislation to handle terrorism, or do we on the other hand simply need stricter and more intelligent enforcement of already existing laws?
I don't think existing laws can meet the threat of terrorism. It has to be special legislation. We've had a different legislation earlier and a different legislation now. With slight changes, it's more or less the same, this thing. And without special legislation, I don't think we can manage.
Would you accept that, Mr. Singhvi? Because many who argue on that side of the debate would say that the existing Indian Penal Code may be sufficient for individual acts of crime, but it clearly cannot plug the loopholes of terrorism and conspiracy, and until those loopholes are plugged, you're not really going to be able to tackle the problem.
Well, 3 points. I broadly agree with the latter part of your formulation, that you need better policing and not tougher laws. But 3 facets of it. First of all, when we say that you have the IPC, obviously one doesn't mean that the IPC by itself is sufficient. Don't forget, you have the IPC, you have preventive detention laws in almost every state, you have special laws for essential services, you have special laws for the Northeast and for Jammu and Kashmir. You have a variety of laws, and if you see a complete seamless web created by them, then you have a pretty large number of laws in your basket. Second, I think that India has traditionally been, and a lot of other countries also I believe, a over-legislated, under-enforced country. You have this feeling of safety and confidence just because you go ahead and enact a law, and then you can ignore lackadaisical policing, insufficient intelligence gathering. Terrorists are caught more by good intelligence gathering than by mere tougher laws.
And the third?
Lack of extradition treaties.
And the third?
And the third is that I think you should make a distinction between simply passing tougher laws and perhaps plugging the loopholes and improving some of the existing laws.
So look,
the second part you can do.
Look within the laws for the problems rather than simply have new blanket
legislation. Let me just give a quick example of the second part. You need, for example, today itself there's a proposal to reform the criminal justice system by saying that for recording confessions, a huge problem is that confessions are not admissible simply normally. Now, to make confessions admissible, you may have a special law in the existing law. You may have a special provision in the existing law by amendment. But put a safeguard like videotaping the entire confession.
That's a very fair point. Let me put this to you, Mr. Gill. The problem that many who speak on his side point towards is this. If you have special legislation specifically to handle terrorism, then you have to define what you mean by terrorism. Now, we in India came up with special legislation. It's called the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and it defines terrorism with the phrase any act or thing. Now, that is so vague as to be either meaningless or to be open to complete misuse.
You see, misuse is something which is talked about a lot, and in some states there was misuse. For instance, when the previous law was there, Gujarat was the state which was having the maximum number of cases under the Terrorist Act.
And the least terrorism.
There was no terrorism there.
So
that misuse is governmental misuse. When the government itself decides that we shall misuse the law like this, then there's very little you can do about it. But if I go back to Punjab, there was hardly a complaint of misuse of the law.
So this is a very interesting distinction you're drawing. You're conceding, as perhaps this country's most famous former police chief, that misuse happens, but it happens because of the government, not because the law per se is bad.
Yes, because Mr. Singhvi said that now we must have um, tough policing or tight policing or enforcement. Ultimately, the tremendous interference by politicians into the normal policing in the country, it is so excessive.
And you think redesigned and tougher legislation would somehow prevent this sort of political interference?
Because what happens is that you have to apply those laws once you have them on the statute.
Oh, and so therefore there's not much room for maneuver and political manipulation.
Yes.
Let me put in a sense the point he's making. He's actually arguing that it's not the law that's bad, it's the people who implement it, as he said, the government that are bad. And in that instance, you should turn against those enforcing the law, not turn against the legislation.
Whether it is the existing legislation or a new tougher legislation, please don't forget that every legislation has a very large component of discretion. There can never be a legislation covering every situation. So the tougher law which you call for to eliminate the discretion in the old law will have a discretion of its own in the new law. Now therefore that discretion in POTA, for example, will be equally liable to be misused.
POTA, I should just put in for the sake of the audience, the new Prevention of Terrorism Act.
Now take for example, we had a few months of Prevention of Terrorism Act, a year or so. You already have several reports. Children in Jharkhand, families in Jammu and Kashmir, person picked up in Delhi. Even in the infamous, famous Parliament assault case, you have somebody, it's a very sensational trial going on. But even there is a very strong argument going on which the appeal is founded at the moment, that the intercepts of the communications was not done following the procedure in the POTA.
Let me put a twist on the point he's making, because in a sense what he's pointing towards is the fact that it's not just governments that misuse it. When you have this sort of special tough legislation, you give them a weapon for vendettas. And you've seen in the case of POTA that politicians themselves, whether it's Mr. Vaiko or Mr. Raja Bhaiya, are becoming targets of their adversaries, and the law is being used for vendetta rather than justice.
That is the situation at the moment. It's very unfortunate, but you can't deny the situation.
But then wouldn't the position that you're boxing yourself into suggest that you may need tough legislation, but because the character of Indian politicians can't be relied upon to be objective, they will misuse it?
But there are more safeguards under the POTA, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, than there are under any act. There are these review committees, and there were review committees in Punjab also.
Do you think he's overlooking that side of the legislation?
I don't know.
Can I just say this? You see, a legislation is not designed keeping the fact that Mr. Gill, a bona fide person, is going to enforce it in Pakistan, in Punjab. I dare say he did an excellent job in Punjab. But you cannot assume that this is the way it's going to happen elsewhere. He has rightly said, very fairly, that you have these abuses. Now you have to...
So a legislation has to be designed with the possibility that the worst sort of person will use it.
Or not only that, keeping in view the fact that the propensity is, the statistical averages for the misuse element.
But you're also going a shade further, even though you're not saying it as clearly. You're suggesting this tough legislation in the hands of politicians you can't rely upon is inviting mischief.
Well, it's giving them a huge amount of power and discretion to do mischief, and human nature being what it is, our past experience being what it is, our experience of the last 1.5 years being what it is, why should we disbelieve it? Okay. Take for example the confession point I made. Mr. Gill rightly says there should be safeguards, there can be safeguards. Do you know that in POTA a confession is admissible? And we all understand why under the ancient common law up to date, confessions have been held not admissible, because it's the easiest way to abdicate your responsibilities of good policing.
But what's the point
of making? Come up with a confession.
But what's the point
now,
of making?
POTA does not put any safeguard. It says any confession in writing or otherwise, provided it's above a
so you're
rank.
saying that in fact the safeguards that Mr. Gill alluded to are not quite there in the shape and form he thinks they are.
Yes.
But what about something else? There is a bigger concern with special legislation, and this arises out of our previous, not our present experience, the so-called TADA, Terrorism and Destructive Activities Act. Now during the 10 years it was in application, some 77,000 people were arrested, only 8,000 tried, and less than 1% convicted. It seems that even when we do have tough legislation, it doesn't deliver.
You see, you remember the Black Thunder operation. There were confessions made before the SSP. The whole thing, the whole operation was videotaped, and every single accused was let off without being charged
Why?
because the judges were afraid.
So in other words, the problem once again is not that the laws don't deliver, the judges don't use them.
Yes.
That's the whole point. Does a tougher law take care of a scared judge? Does a tougher law take care of in fact, he makes the valid point. A confession which is videotaped or videotaped and taken before a magistrate, nobody would have an objection to having it admissible.
Well, this is
But
very
Pota doesn't say that. Pota says a confession in writing. Today's recommendations for amendment of the criminal justice system propose that a confession be videotaped, and I would add, they don't propose, they should have proposed, made
But
before a magistrate.
let's not get lost in the minutiae and details of the actual admission part of the law. The bigger point that you accept is that Pota or any other special law doesn't take into account the fact that governments may be venal, politicians may use it for vendetta purposes, the judge may be too scared to implement it. So you could end up with a good law in theory, which becomes in fact in practice a millstone around everyone's neck. Gentlemen, let's take a break then, come back in part 2 and talk about the other side of the equation, the way the police handle terrorist cases, and ask ourselves whether that's an area that needs to be examined. That's the subject after the break. See you in part 2. Welcome back to the India debate. How does India handle terrorism? Mr. Gill, let's turn now to the police side of this equation. It's often said that the biggest problem in India is that the police take shortcuts and they arrange for people in their custody who may be accused to die in what are called police encounters. And these are nothing more than staged killings. How serious a problem is this? How much of a blotch on the reputation of the police is this?
Well, it's a mixed bag, I should say. Let's go back to Punjab. There were 1,800 policemen and other people like Home Guards, the CRPF, BSF, who were killed by terrorists. And they, as I made a statement at that time, that they did not kill themselves to show that this is a...
So you are saying that in every encounter, the deaths are usually greater on the police side than on the side of the terrorists?
No. If you have a properly trained police force, the deaths will be more on the side of the terrorists. But it's a question of whether the terrorist stands and fights.
So are you suggesting that in fact the police encounter is wrongly understood and that the police are wrongly blamed?
I would say in a very large number of cases.
Would you accept that?
I think, well, I happen to have been amicus curiae by the Supreme Court in the whole issue of custodial deaths. And we saw figures from all over India, from 97 up to date. There are two kinds of encounters. One is the one you're talking about, where there is an encounter with a terrorist force from outside. The largest number of encounters and deaths take place in cases where people are already in custody or are being transported from point to point. You have...
And those are encounters that you're totally suspicious of?
Highly suspicious of. In fact, the records, the figures establish that people who are being transported, people who are being taken to jail, people who are being taken for interrogation, they mysteriously die in encounters. We've had from the infamous days of Sundar's case, where a man supposedly just got off the truck and jumped into the Yamuna and was shown as dead.
Let me put it like this, Mr. Gill. Many people would say that when these sort of encounters, what Mr. Singhvi calls the second type of encounter, happens, it's the police taking shortcuts. Is it legitimate for them to take shortcuts?
I'll tell you a story. Punjab terrorism was over. One old man, about 75 years old, came to my office. He had a wedding in the family, and his two grandchildren, not brother and sister, but cousins, they had gone out to play in the fields. The boy was sodomized, the girl was raped and killed. The culprit was found. It was charge sheeted. He came to me, his only complaint was, and this is a reflection on our criminal justice system. He says, "Sir, why didn't the police encounter them?"
In other words, if the police had encountered them, I would have got justice. But when you leave them to the criminal justice system, things go wrong. Let me put that to you. Many people say that our system of justice is slow, that witnesses are scared of reprisal and therefore don't actually give evidence. Society as a whole doesn't stand behind the security forces because there's a liberal tradition to sort of back off and disown them. That being the case, do you blame policemen who give their lives and then find that their children are killed and they don't get justice?
I'd agree with a substantial part of what you're saying. Our system is very slow. We need a total overall, we need a 220 volt electric shock through our criminal justice system. We need to reform, we need a witness protection program, we need safeguards of videotaping for confessions, we need new magistracy, we need a whole lot of things, which is precisely the point. We do not need tougher laws which are ornamental showpieces, because they become a substitute for all this.
Along with all the things you say we need, would you also say that we need better training for the police? Maybe just
that I would say number one. I think there is nothing more important.
Psychological as well as military training.
Complete holistic overall training, education, actually sensitizing them to real life experiences, training them abroad, training them in India, training them in every situation,
Would you accept
and training
that,
at the
Mr.
bottom.
Gill? Everyone these days talks about changing mindsets. It's become the in phrase. Does the police need its mindset changed?
You see, one gets back again and again to all these very, shall we say, very great ideas. But what does the man in the street want? He wants that when he finishes his day, and if whatever he has earned, he should be able to carry it home.
So in other words, the man on the street would be in favor of encounters if it delivers justice.
If it delivers justice.
Catch the crooks. I don't care how you do it.
How you do it.
Gentlemen, let's take a break, then come back and talk about not the police system, not the laws, but the third part of the equation, the context in which terrorism comes up. Do we in India pay sufficient attention to it? And if not, should we be paying more? That's the subject in the last part. Stick with us. Welcome back to the last part of the India debate on the handling of terrorism in India. Mr. Singhvi, usually all terrorism happens within a context, and more often than not that's either poverty or some form of political alienation. Do we in India pay sufficient cause and attention to the root causes of terrorism?
That's the fundamental difference. When we talk of legal regimes dealing with terrorism, you cannot, and I believe should not, go into the phrase causes of terrorism. But when you talk of handling terrorism, how to solve terrorism, you must talk only of the causes of terrorism.
And do we do enough of that in India?
We don't do enough of that, which is why new experiments with that, for example, the new healing touch policy, so-called healing touch policy, and much misunderstood healing touch policy of Jammu and Kashmir is, I believe, very laudable. Unless you address those issues, which are the root causes, you cannot get them back in the mainstream. Mr. Gill will be, I think, the first to agree that terrorism in Punjab ultimately died out not because he enforced a danda on the Punjab people, that helped in catching the real culprits, but it also died down because from deep within, the alienated youth, the misguided persons, were somehow either convinced or brought back into the mainstream.
Would you accept that as a policeman, that at the end of the day there is only so much that the police or laws can do? Politicians have to step in and tackle the real alienation.
I think that is very, very important. But just a few days back, I was in Kashmir and Jammu attending a seminar on terrorism. It's the most popular subject these days. And one of the journalists came and said that good governance is an answer to terrorism. So I said, if we are going to look for good governance in India, with the present political and bureaucratic and whatever apparatus we have, well, it's going to take 1,000 years. And it doesn't mean that we can wait for that long.
Now, this is a very interesting point you're making. You seem to me to be suggesting that whilst political solutions are the only long-term solutions, the problem is that Indian politicians are too short-term in their outlook, too populist in their attitude to be able to provide good governance. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. It's not doling out jobs and money, which is good governance. Let's take law and order. How do you investigate an ordinary case of a fray? Are you fair? Have you applied the law fairly? Do the people trust you? That is very, very, even if you're going to remove alienation, it's not sweet talk.
You know, there's a lot that Mr. Gill is saying that most Indians would agree with, that our politicians don't live up to the job we entrust them with. So when you say that they don't actually tackle the political root causes, are they capable of tackling them given their character?
Well, I think good governance is perhaps too large, too amorphous a phrase. When you say you must look at the causes of terrorism, you have to actually be specific. You have to address good governance is necessary for the entire country, is necessary for governing and running the country. But handling terrorism requires a more pointed approach. Certainly, all aspects have to be seen. Well, I think if the politicians are good enough to run the country in whatever way, they have to be good enough to handle terrorism.
Except for one
Ultimately,
thing,
a democratic country is run by politicians. I think there is a mixed bag. There are politicians who are venal, there are politicians who are bad, but happily now, I think a new definition of politics is emerging, a new paradigm is emerging. There are people who are committed, there are people for whom politics is not the refuge of last resort,
you see,
and we have to put our hope in them.
that is a hope, but is it reality? Because one of the truths that we can't escape from is the fact that our attitude to terrorism veers between a political approach which is never taken to its logical conclusion, or a law and order response that gets derailed because of popular public protest. And we veer between the two, confusing the security apparatus and confusing the country.
That may well be true, and it is, I think, substantially true, and the truth therefore lies in a holistic program which combines both those. It has to be a law and order problem, no doubt about it. It has to be combined with a political, social approach. Jobs are important, handling people is important, educating them is important, preaching to them is important, and just drawing them physically back. The distinction in Jammu and Kashmir between the foreign terrorists and the local alienated youth is, I think, a very important part of the identification process.
Let me broaden the question and put it like this to you, Mr. Gill. Do you think, as a security officer, as a police chief, as a man who understands the nature of terrorism, that perhaps democracies per se are not good at handling terrorism? That the manner in which they become susceptible to popular pressure means that toughness is something democratic leaderships are only rarely capable of?
No, I think terrorism can only be tackled through democracy. There's no other way.
Not dictatorships,
No,
not military
we had presidents' rules in Assam and Punjab, and I thought they were not at all capable, because we do not have administrators and bureaucrats of stature like we had, say, 30 years back. Now, there's no hope but in the politician, and no hope but in democracy if we are to tackle it.
And yet at the same time you'd say the type of politicians who come to power don't actually give you much hope either.
No, what he has said is right. There is this, you have this incumbency factor. That is, people are rejecting. They give a chance.
So on this critical point you are at one with him.
Yes.
You share his belief that there is a new generation of politicians who are more astute and more capable of holding the balance and doing both.
Yes. And what is now for Kashmir, for instance, I think you are getting a two-party government system. In Assam, you are getting a two-party system.
In a word, therefore, you are confident and optimistic?
Yes.
In a word, confident and optimistic?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, when both our guests are completely in agreement, I think it's time to bring this particular show to an end. Of course, the handling of terrorism is a problem India will face for years to come, but at least we can leave you with optimism that both our guests are confident it's being handled more astutely. See you next week. Till then, goodbye.